Today we are going to speak on Macbeth. Now, Macbeth is of course celebrated universally as one of Shakespeare's four greatest tragedies. If you take Jeeves in it, you would say one of the five greatest tragedies. It is also been seen widely as Shakespeare's profoundest study of evil. That is another question. Now, today we are going to discuss how interestingly, in spite of being so extensively written, Macbeth has been an underexplored play. It has been seen as a revenge tragedy in the Senecan mold, where Macbeth, a great general with many sterling qualities, falls because of his one tragic flaw, ambition. I'm not saying that this is a wrong way of looking at the play. Especially, of course, there cannot be ever a claim for one right way of understanding a play. And if that play's author happens to be Shakespeare. But I believe that if you read Macbeth as probably a more developed version of Edward II, and Macbeth something like Mortimer, whose excesses lead to his downfall, we will be missing not the heart of the play, that which makes it unique and I would say so terrifying a play. In fact, it is in some ways a more pioneering play, like Hamlet, and unlike Othello or Lear, for instance, where he uses conventional methods, but in Macbeth, Shakespeare almost overreaches himself or goes beyond his own limits. We'll come to that. But I'm therefore trying to keep this lecture short and focused on just one aspect of his play, of his character. It is supposed to be the tragedy of ambition, Macbeth's ambition, that is. And that, as I said, is not incorrect. But that's definitely inadequate. Because, as I said already, Macbeth poses multiple problems and multiple difficulties in understanding. Tragedy, if we go by Nietzsche's, probably is more correct, history of the birth of tragedy, arose from those Dionysian or Dionysiac celebrations. And it is seen by Nietzsche as a fusion of the Apollonian, which means something which is more transparent, classical, formal, structured, and whose type would be sculpture and plastic arts, and the Dionysian, which is much less structured, fluent, and emotionally charged, and has enthusiasm, and probably draws on, definitely draws on the deeper recesses of the psychic energy. And for Nietzsche, an exemplar of the Dionysian aspect of art is music. Music is the typical Dionysian art, as sculpture is architecture. Now, out of this fusion of tragedy arose, it meant to him and to many others that the structured world, the transparent world, the comprehensible world is something which does not explain the well springs of creativity and forms of creation. And that is found in tragedy. Otherwise, the question is, why should those wildness or even the violence of tragedy should be celebrated year after year in the Dionysian festivals? And why should it be introduced by Epictetus in Athens? And why should it have the claim to the premier status in literature? This is, well, I'll try to keep this short but then it has some bearing on it. This is something with which Aristotle also grappled in Poetics, where he said one thing, that when we have aestheticized representation of terror, it gives us pleasure, a different kind of a pleasure, and finally it transforms us from inside, because of course that this is regulated and we see it from a distance and from safety, and it arouses just that kind of a degree of pity and fear which is healthy for us. Well, okay, I will not go in because so much discussion has gone into it, with Lucas saying that we do not go to the theatre like going to the hospital. But at least we agree that however unpleasant the direct experience of pain or suffering or violence may be, when it is transformed into art, when it is mediated, it can be a source of artistic pleasure and joy. Coming from this, or starting from here, Aristotle at least gives not only legitimacy but high respect to a new form of art which is extra, I would say, rational in some ways. In other words, reason or rationality, the celebration of tragedy assumes is not enough, or it does not take us to the farthest reaches of the human mind or the human thirst for artistic pleasure. But still, though I would say that there are differences between Aristotle, very significant differences between Aristotle and Nietzsche. Aristotle says that tragedy should be a representation of an action which is serious, which is complete, and which of course has a beginning, a middle, and ending, but which should not, having made a distinction between what is artistic and what is ethical, he also does not abjure the ethical moorings of art, and said that it should not be something, it should not outrage our morality, and therefore it should not show, it should show the change in fortune of a man, basically a good man, and fundamentally mostly a man better than us, and it should not show the prosperity of either a good man who's morally good, or the devastation of, prosperity of a bad man, of evil man, or the devastation or the defeat, unmerited, of a good man. Now, even this good and bad differences and duality, Nietzsche pays much less heed to it. But of all the plays and all the great works of art, the one play which poses the greatest difficulty in fitting tragedy or an example of tragedy to Aristotle's definition or exploration is Macbeth. Outwardly, you can say it does not, because Macbeth is, first of all, we do not know, is Macbeth basically a good man? Is he primarily a good man? And if there is a fall in his fortune from prosperity to destruction, then only this can be tragic. But then, though the Greeks did not have generally a character who is villain, because they had antagonists, but actually fate played such a big role. Sometimes fate itself took the role that in Renaissance tragedy of an antagonist, that in Renaissance tragedy is played by the villain. So Now the question is, of course, you could easily say that Shakespeare did not read Aristotle, and Shakespearean tragedy does not fit into it. But then we have an understanding of tragedy first when Shakespeare was a child. It was translated in Europe, and Shakespeare, I presume, would have understood this, would have be acquainted with this, or even more importantly, that when Seneca took the Greek models and reworked, and the Senecan tragedy influenced Renaissance tragedy, he was already using the Aristotelian template. And if we take Macbeth out, then we can see that this contrast between good and evil, the hubris, hamartia, the flaw and the fall of a basically good man, etc., etc., fits into most of Shakespeare's tragedies as well. And that is the reason why I said, what then do we do with Macbeth? Because all the good things in Macbeth are greatness of Macbeth is almost exhausted, in fact, in scene 1. In Act 1. And from the end of Act 1, Macbeth becomes a die-hard villain. And then, of course, you can see this as again, a revenge tragedy. But can you see this as tragedy? Is Macbeth the hero of the tragedy till the end, structurally and thematically? I believe an answer can only come if we see Macbeth's so-called villainy, the great evil in Macbeth, within a context of a greater struggle and the role of fate. In this way, I believe Macbeth poses certain problems as well. Because you must remember, okay, I will come to that. Interestingly, we have two pictures of Macbeth here in this play. One is when he comes back from battlefield and his feats are described. He's mentioned, this is Act 1, Scene 2, by the captain. But all's too weak for brave Macbeth. Well, he deserves that name. Disdaining fortune with his brandished steel, which smoked with bloody execution, like valor's minion carved out his passage till he faced the slave, which ne'er shook hands nor bade farewell to him, till he unseamed him from the nave with the chops and fixed his head upon the battlements. So, he very early on, Act 1, Scene 2, he is valor's minion. And then again, in 35, he is Bellona's bridegroom lapped in proof. Though there are some editors who find this description of Ross problematic and say this could not be Macbeth, it is a reference to someone else, probably to Macduff. But then if you read the play well, so anybody else would make this the whole construction and the syntax almost meaningless. So we assume that this is again Macbeth, who is Bellona's bridegroom. But even before that, and I must say that there is no other character who is the bridegroom, the husband of the goddess of war, and who is the minion of valor, whose first words are almost a complete echo of the words of the witches. The witches' first words are, or let's say, early words are, if not exactly first, that is, fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and fill the air. And one great director actually, Orson Welles, did not place the scene on the heath or in particularly in Scotland, but he took it from the voodoo representation of Macbeth and an indeterminate place, meaning, of course, an universal place, which is the soul of man. And truly, these words of the witches are echoed the very first words of Macbeth, when he says, "So fair and foul a day I have not seen." So already, what is it that we see? By Act 1, we see Macbeth's deep kinship, suggested deep kinship with the witches, and Macbeth's almost near identity with the god of war. That poses a problem, but that is the heart of the mystery of Macbeth. Because he is both. He is, of course, the hero of the play, but he is also the villain of the play. And that leads to another problem. How will you have the same character as the hero and the villain? You can have this in a kind of a medieval play, an everyman, where or a kind of a psychic drama played out, an interiorized play. But how will you have this in a 5-act play with quasi-historical claims? And how can this be structured? Who is then the antagonist? How is Macbeth fighting? And what then is, how do we explain what is his tragic flaw? First, let me say that hamartia, or tragic flaw, is not enough or a satisfactory word to explain Macbeth's ambition, because there, in Greek, it meant an error of judgment. In Macbeth, it means something much more terrible. It is the complete distortion, perversion of the will. So, I believe, and therefore, what happens is, we see Macbeth 2 parts, and these 2 parts become separate later, when one part of Macbeth, as Bellona's bridegroom, is taken over by during the end, after Macduff goes to England, as when by him, and with Malcolm as a supporting role and Seward, and the other half, that Macbeth, who is a kinsman of the witches, the dark forces, the devil's kinsman, that gets more and more magnified there. So what is actually in Macbeth, I see this as a conflict between Macbeth and Macbeth, not so much as Macbeth and the others, and one part of Macbeth is taken over dramatically by Macduff, and the other part remains with him. So, but even that does not explain everything. Again we go back to Aristotle, if he is really a tragic hero, then there must be more than a conflict between just one flaw, which is ambition, and his physical courage, and that too which is almost exhausted by Act 1. If it is, as Rebelson Knight says, the deepest exploration of evil, then we must understand how this evil leads to the conflict, an irresolvable conflict, and how this is actually universal and how it is contemporary and how it is terrifying. The common understanding of the play is, and when I say the common understanding, even I mean by great directors. Well, this is a harsh word and probably not politically correct to use, but I would say that they are misleading. For example, Rupert Gould's Macbeth, where Patrick Stewart plays Macbeth and Kate Fleetwood plays his sexually enticing wife. And Macbeth is swarthy, oldish man, and he is taken over, completely dominated by his wife, and does not have the agency, or at least the prime agency of his action. I believe looking at this or analyzing as this play, directing it as Rupert Gould did, is to miss the central point, the main point of the play. And if a more famous misrepresentation, in my view, is that of Akira Kurosawa, whose Throne of Blood also sees Macbeth as somehow under the thumb of Lady Macbeth, and who is egged on, pushed over the precipice by the influence of Lady Macbeth. I said that I wanted to keep this a little focused. So we should basically, I will not go to the other aspects. I will just dwell on the relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and the impact or influence of this relationship on the development of this tragedy. That's one thing. Lady Macbeth's character comes, and that's useful for us. And actually what then lies, as I said, as claimed at the heart of Macbeth's tragedy. The very first question, of course, is tragedy, when it came to the Renaissance and when it flowered, was an offshoot, one form of humanism. And so when Aristotle said that this is a study or representation of action, who is basically good, and humanism saw man as one having agency, having autonomy, having almost godlike shine, splendor. That is the man who is very, very different from the characters that we have in the Middle Ages or in the miracle plays. And therefore, man as one who is governed above all things by reason, the word reason as understood during the Renaissance, and having agency and autonomy, and who was almost perhaps the person who is most responsible for painting this picture is of man, of the Renaissance man is Pico della Mirandola, whose oration on the dignity of man speaks about of the chain of beings and man alone being free in creation and therefore being free to shape himself, to fashion himself, and choose anything that he wants to be between the angels and the worms. And in literature, of course, the best echo of Mirandola's picture of man is found in Hamlet, where Hamlet says, "What a piece of work is man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals." And yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? So this picture, that means, of course, man is capable of self-fashioning, of self-creation. He is, in some way, sui generis. The kind of freedom that he has was not given to the man in literature in the Middle Ages. And tragedy comes from this who chooses through an error. So that man can be godlike and man can be almost devilish. Out of these two potentials and out of the conflict between the two potentials, because both the potentials are active in man, we have tragedy. Because that alone, among all art forms, explores the two extremes of human character, of a Iago and a Desdemona. Even here, you could say, in this play here, the difference between Duncan, who is almost angel, and Macbeth, who becomes infernal. But because the problem that lies somewhere else, but this is chosen, this fate of his, man's, is chosen by him, at least in Renaissance tragedy. Unlike in Greek tragedy, where man is not free. Man apparently is free, but then Oedipus was free to kill his father, but he did not know that Laius was his father. Or when it comes to Hebus, he did not know that Iocaste was his mother. So man in Greek tragedy is trapped. Fate plays a bigger role in Greek tragedy, and in Renaissance tragedy and humanism, man has a kind of freedom to transform himself into a god. And we have this probably most notably in Marlowe's Tamburlaine, where Tamburlaine says that to be God is nothing. In fact, he rises above God. But then Tamburlaine is free. Is Macbeth free? Now here I must say, when I say is Macbeth free, and if freedom is so essential for tragedy, there is a problem. Almost all serious philosophers think that man is not free, whereas almost all artists and critics think, and especially after the Enlightenment and in the Renaissance, that man is free. I am not going into that. In other words, as Oscar Wilde had once said famously, that our genes are our destiny. Now we know that we are not free. There are so many factors that control us. But in a way, I suppose we understand when we say whether we are free or not, when we contrast the relative unfreedom of the characters in Greek tragedy and the freedom of the characters like Tamburlaine or even Hamlet. But the question is Macbeth free? Well, when I bring Hamlet, freedom becomes problematic, because Hamlet is the most intellectual of all probably Shakespearean heroes, but ironically, he does not understand himself. And nothing and nowhere is it brought out more clearly than in Act 2 and 3, where Hamlet says, "Oh, what a rogue and a peasant slave am I! Is it not monstrous this player here," etc., etc. Where he accuses himself of not being able to walk up a rage against his usurping uncle and kill him. But just a little later, he goes on to give a completely different explanation, when in that great soliloquy, to be or not to be, that is a question, whether it's noble in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, etc. Because just a little later, Hamlet says, first, you see, if you look at it, Hamlet blames himself for not killing, and then he thinks that the most rational thing in the world is to take up arms against a sea of troubles, that is to commit suicide. And then he says that suicide is not an option because of the dread, that is, because of the dread of the world after death. That is what he says, I think. Of what comes after death, and the country from whose bone no traveler returns. And he says that this fear of the unknown, of what will happen, probably to the soul, he doesn't explain this. If one commits suicide, that puzzles the will, and conscience makes thus conscience doth make cowards of us all. So we already have 1, 2, 3 explanations, and we have a fourth explanation for his inactivity when he doesn't kill Claudius, because Claudius, if he kills Claudius, Claudius will go to heaven. So one thing we know is Hamlet, the person, is much more complex than, and perhaps even beyond the power of Hamlet the intellectual, Hamlet the explorer of the human soul. He fails to explore himself. But this is not a failure. I would say that he is not free, because he is free to kill, and finally he does. But his will is paralyzed for some reason or something inside him. Probably because I here would agree with Freud, because subconsciously, unconsciously, Hamlet finds a kindred spirit in Claudius, because Claudius has done what Hamlet would like to do: kill his father and marry his mother. So the Oedipus complex in Hamlet has been explored so much. Hamlet himself is not aware, or as some critics have thought that maybe because the revenge, ethics of revenge is no longer serviceable for a man who's come from the universities of Germany and who is the first modern man in Western literature. Whatever. The fact is, Hamlet is free, though he is incapable of using his freedom. But then here, that's what I wanted to say. Macbeth, I believe, is not free. And that is a point that I took so much time to come to. Because, and it is not Lady Macbeth, in my opinion, who compels Macbeth to commit the crime. Of course, she plays the role of the catalyst, like the witches. And to understand, therefore, the trajectory of this tragedy, we have to explore the text. I believe that Macbeth's character has been explored in abstraction a great deal, but we have not paid enough attention to the text and close attention to the text. The first time, you see, when Macbeth shudders, or something, we feel something is terribly wrong, is in Act 1, Scene 3. When he says in his aside, this supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good. If ill, why hath it given me earnest of success, commencing in truth? I am Thane Porter. If good, why do I yield to that suggestion whose horrid image doth unfix my hair and make my seated heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature? Present fears are less than horrible imaginings. My thought, whose murder yet is but fantastical, shakes so my single state of mind that function is smothered in some surmise, and nothing is but what is not. Do we realize that this holds the key to the plea? First, of course, even before that, he says that Everybody notices that Macbeth is shuddering. And Banquo says that, see, why do you start? He asks her. And then Macbeth says, this starting, and when he says that my horrid images unfix my hair and make my sated heart knock at my ribs, it just cannot be a thought. It is something much greater than a thought, and I would seriously argue, and in the continuity, in the context of what follows, that already Macbeth, in his imagination, we know that he has a hyperactive imagination, and an hyperactive imagination takes, in his case, the shape of hallucination. And here, his hallucination is, Shakespeare does not dwell upon, but it must be a hallucination. He must have thought this and seen this and shuddered at what he thought and saw. But there is something more important. He did not just shudder. He must have felt, however faintly, that this is his fate, that he cannot escape this. In other words, he is not free. This is going to catch him. It is going to make him do what his reason does not want him to do, and he rationally does not want to do. Fast forward a little and come to the great soliloquy in Act 1, Scene 7, where Macbeth says, we will proceed no further in this business, etc. A little earlier, just yes, still Scene 7, where, and I believe that Macbeth, the text of Macbeth needs to be analyzed to an extent which it has not been done even by great critics or distinguished critics, where in the great soliloquy, Macbeth says, if it were done when it is done, then it were done quickly. If the assassination could trammel up the consequences and catch with his seized success, that but this blow might be the be-all and the end-all but here upon this bank and shoal of time, we would jump the life to come. But in these cases, we still have judgment here, that we but teach blood instructions which being taught return to plague the infector. This even-handed justice commends the ingredients of our poison chalice to our own lips. He is here in double trust. First, as I am his kinsman and his subject, strong both against the deed. Then, as his host who should against his murder shut the door, nor bear the night myself. Besides this, Duncan hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office, that his virtues will plead like angels, trumpet tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off. And pity, like a naked newborn babe, striding the blast, or heaven's cherubim, horsed upon the sightless curious of the air, shall blow the horrid deed in every eye, that tears shall drown the wind. I have no spur to beat the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which overleaps itself and falls on love. Now, I would say that no one, nowhere can say more than this against the murder of Duncan. But Lady Macbeth will come, of course. You can call her the fourth witch if you like, and persuade her, quote unquote, persuade her to murder Duncan. But again, it is not Lady Macbeth. Lady Macbeth gives a little push, a catalyst. The gun is loaded. Even she doesn't pull the trigger. She helps a bit in pulling the trigger. It is Macbeth who does this. Because after this speech, How can he do it? Because this is what he understands. This is his intellect. His reason tells him about Duncan. But there is something which is more fundamental in his case and which is flawed, which he had already seen once when the witches had told him, and he was shuddering and his hair stood up and his heart was beating against his ribs. And again, it takes a little more dramatic turn when Lady Macbeth supposedly pushes him. Actually, she could not have done that had it not been, as I read this, Macbeth was destined and he knew it. And that's why he was so terrified to murder Duncan. At the thought of murdering Duncan. And this is brought out very clearly. We read these asides and the soliloquies, but we do not connect them. Look here. It was not necessary dramatically for Macbeth to visualize the dagger. But he does. And he says, "Is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle towards my hand? Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. Art thou not fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? Or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation proceeding from the heat of breast brain? I see thee yet in form as palpable as this which now I draw. Thou masterest me the way that I was going, and such an instrument I was to use." Then he says, "Mine eyes are made the fools of the other senses, or else worth all the rest." It says all. In other words, his understanding and his imagination are now cut into two, are separate. And it is clear that Macbeth would be guided by his imagination, because he does not have power over his imagination. His imagination rights him. He is the slave of his imagination. And Shakespeare will stress this again a few lines later, when he says when he will again hear voices. "Methought I heard a voice cry," is that so? "Methought I heard a voice cry, said, sleep no more. Macbeth does murder sleep. Macbeth does murder sleep. The innocent sleep that knits up, the revel sleep of care, and goes on and on. We don't have to say this. Why don't we see that all these hallucinations? The first hallucination is the one that Macbeth is not very explicit on when he hears the witches, is now driving him to do this act. Now again, I am connecting this with what I said about Mirandola, about Renaissance tragedy, about man as a free agent and the fashioning of the self. How then can Macbeth fit into the mold of Renaissance tragedy? My answer is, Macbeth does not quite fit into it. But I believe that this has to Macbeth does not fit into the scheme of the Renaissance tragedy with the idea of man's agency and freedom. Because these are the two things that Macbeth does. In fact, Helen Gardner, in a remarkable essay, studied three damned characters in Renaissance literature: Sem-II, Macbeth, and Dr. Faustus. So, in fact, Macbeth is damned. And but then, even he is damned, of course, for what he has done.
he says this, for Banquo's issue have I filed my mind, for them the gracious Duncan have I murdered, put rankers in the vessels of peace of my peace, only for them, and mine eternal jewel given to the common enemy of man. That's the devil. But the fact remains that he did not. If we follow, of course, and analyze, and what I am trying to argue is that Macbeth had little choice but to follow his imagination. And it is his imagination that took sometimes visual shapes, sometimes auditory shapes. Again, it will take it will see Banquo's ghost in that scene. But not only, of course, not only does imagination play havoc on Macbeth, here we see this. Not only is, right, this way, not only is imagination extremely powerful, but it plays havoc on him, it suffers for him. And it's clear, I think most clearly from the banquet scene, that Macbeth is not the master of his imagination. And if his imagination drives him, pushes him, controls him, then how can we call saying that Macbeth is free and that this is a tragedy like this, or that Lady Macbeth had pushed him into doing this, or his ambition had just done this, that he was a free man to choose his path and he chose it freely, is, to me, a complete misunderstanding and a mistreating of the play. It would be much easier to understand, as Erich Fromm had written in his famous book, The Fear of Freedom, that in 17th century England, the Calvinist idea of predestination had taken hold on Shakespeare's church too. And Calvin, of course, is the most terrible of all Christian theologians. And he argues that even before we are born, our fate is decided. Some of us are elect, we are saved, and others are damned. Did Shakespeare use it consciously? That's a redundant question. Fact is, the question we should ask is, does Shakespeare's play, as he wrote it, explore the idea? I would say very strongly. Because if Macbeth is the reprobate, if Macbeth's will is corrupted, it is also clear that Macbeth vehemently, strongly, almost heroically struggles to keep it at bay, to remain good, to wear the clothes that he has newly worn, and exult in the honors that he has got. But surely he cannot do this. He cannot do this because he is fated to go downhill. And he, as he says, that he has thrown his eternal jewel to the common enemy of man, that he has given to the devil. Mine eternal jewel given to the common enemy of man. He speaks of his own damnation. So then again, there is another problem. Macbeth, whose damnation comes, he is of course the magnificent hero for a brief while. Then he turns a despicable, terrible tyrant. And perhaps that Macbeth's destruction is imminent and is necessary becomes very clear when Ross comes to visit Malcolm and Macduff. And he says, "Alas, poor country, almost afraid to know itself, it cannot be called our mother, but our grave, where nothing but who knows nothing is once seen to smile, where sighs and groans and shrieks that rend the air are made not marked, where violent sorrows seems a modern ecstasy. The dead man's knell is there, scarce asked for who, and good men's lives expire before the flowers in their caps. Dying or they sicken." So this is, Macbeth has this spot, the tyrant has turned the world. And in the same scene, for Act 4, Scene 3, we get a picture of the antithesis of this tyrant. And that is Edward the Confessor, where if Macbeth takes life, Edward gives life. He cures people, he is subjects of the disease called the evil, and he has a miraculous power, most miraculous work in this good king, etc. So this is brought in, and along with this, there is something that Malcolm tells Macduff, where he speaks about himself and he speaks about just Christian virtues. Where he speaks about lowliness, truthfulness, chastity. These are not quite the pagan virtues, but then Shakespeare is not quite Marlowe. And together, Act 4, Scene 3, defines and tells us that Macbeth has to go. Where even Macduff says, "Here abjure the taints and blames I laid upon myself, for strangers to my nature. I'm yet unknown to woman, never was forsworn, scarcely have coveted what was mine own. At no time broke my faith, would not betray the devil to his fellow, and delight no less in truth than life," etc., etc. So, altogether, 4-3 nails the coffin on Macbeth's nails Macbeth's coffin. Okay. Then, as I said, the antagonist, I said the protagonist earlier on, I said both the protagonist and the antagonist are contained in Macbeth. But dramatically, the protagonist has to be externalized. And now, if Macbeth, the actual protagonist becomes Macduff, and Macbeth becomes a villain, and he has to go. But before I end this lecture, there are so many other things, and I would just say that in tragedy is not just a fall or a rise of a common or even an uncommon man. In great tragedy, in the mythopoeic worldview, there is a continuum, a connection between the natural world and the cosmic world, and there is a question of a liberation. Even Hamlet speaks of the time is out of joint, and oh, cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right. So he has to set the time right. And there is a question of liberation of the whole country, because the whole country, or sometimes the whole universe in tragedy, because man and God and natural world and the extra natural or the supernatural, if you like, the cosmic world are connected, which was seen in Macbeth when, on the night of Duncan's murder, when the earth shook, when the eagle was perched upon by a sparrow, when the king's darling horses preyed upon each other, when the sun refused to rise, and there was an untimely and an unscheduled eclipse when darkness entombed the world. So if there is this liberation, not just a political liberation on the where people can eat on the tables, but a kind of liberation of an entire world, something that Yeats called the gaiety of tragedy, when he says that Hamlet and Lear are gay in the old sense, not in the new one. Then Macbeth, if he is the protagonist and the tragic hero, in spite of all his fall, he has to play a role. And I see this and comfort in both his the birth of active comedy speaks about cognate sources, in fact, of tragedy and comedy. And that is also what the Dionysian rituals had, where Dionysus was ritualistically dismembered, killed, and revived. And that also is, this myth runs deep into all cultures. This is the myth of the Eucharist. This is also the myth of Jesus being the lamb who is sacrificed and then he rises again. This is also, again, Abraham sacrificing his son. This sacrifice, and the sacrifice which would lead to regeneration, is also a recurrent motive in great tragedy. Then we know Macbeth is slaughtered, Macbeth is killed, but does he sacrifice himself? Yes, because Macbeth said that his castle would laugh to scorn the siege, and all that he had to do was to stay put in the castle. But you must all remember that Macbeth did not die in his castle. He came out of the castle, the darkness, the prison that Scotland was, and faced the Englishmen, the English soldiers, in the open air, where he fought face to face. And he gave his blood to, of course, willingly or unwillingly, that's a different question, to regenerate and give rebirth to his country. And this way, Macbeth, even when he turns the villain, plays a crucial role, crucial function of the hero. Unfortunately, we could not have enough time to speak about Lady Macbeth's role. We had to restrict ourselves. I had to restrict to Macbeth only. But in this essay, if you think it's too rambling or too sprawling, then at least what I am trying to prove, the central point is that Macbeth is both the hero and the villain. And as the role of the villain becomes his, as a play proceeds, his role of the hero is transferred onto a subsidiary character, which happens to be Macbeth. But more importantly, that Macbeth does not fit into any of our understanding of Renaissance tragedy, and that he is not free in the sense that tragic heroes are free, in the sense even Lear is free or Hamlet is free, and that his imagination is his fate. And the fact is also that it's a deeply religious tragedy, and it has to be read and understood and studied in terms of reprobation, in terms of determination. And in this, it is like Greek tragedy, only it is more fatalist than Greek tragedy, where, of course, the Calvinist ethic or the Calvinist philosophy plays a central role in the play. I end my lecture here.